Okay, so let's get into this. First of all, thank you all for streaming in. So we're going to be talking about what Magic Maestro or what Maestro is actually. We're going to be talking about that. But before that, let me introduce myself. I'm Nishant Srivastava. I'm an Android engineer working here in Berlin. You can also find me on my website with nishrules.com. You probably know me with the same handle everywhere else. Okay, so let's dive into the main problem right away. And the problem that we potentially quite often see is that when, as developers, from the perspective of a developer, when you're writing UI tests, you need to have the knowledge of multiple programming languages, pseudo languages like Kotlin, Java, Swift. I don't know, like for example, you need to know different paradigms. There's different ways of writing these UI tests also. You need to set up a development environment for this. So for example, if you have to set up your Android UI test, you have to have some sort of like the Android Studio setup, and then you need to have some sort of knowledge of testing frameworks like Espresso, Calabash, Appium, UI Automator, Caspresso. Same goes for iOS also. One thing to note though is that all of these things are same across both main mobile platforms, so iOS and Android both. So when I'm talking about these things, I'm also referring to the iOS platform at the same time. And this talk is actually going to be talking more about things as mobile platform rather than being very Android specific. And we'll see the Maestro magic that the title talks about. So yeah, so the problem is related to the programming language, development environment, and the knowledge of different testing frameworks. A lot of like areas that you need to look into before you can start writing UI tests. And then another thing that we need to take care here is that as a developer, responsibility is shared across the designers, the QA folks, also the product owners sometimes. But then developers are in charge of writing those UI tests. They need to go back and communicate with the designer. And then when they are completed writing the feature, you have to go back and forth with the QA people. So basically, all the validation and the communication across different channels is the extra overhead that we are talking about. The designers look at the UI as a design concept. The QA people are looking at it as a code base that they are interacting with what terms of how the UI behaves. And then there is the developers who are basically just trying to complete writing a feature and deliver it so that the product can be shipped out. So at this point, what happens is that everyone is just doing whatever they understand. A developer does as much as they understand, and they write whatever UI test that they think is the correct one. The QA people, they look at the user stories that the product owner has written, and they just go with it and then try to simulate the same thing and try to see if the test is actually doing exactly the same thing that they would expect it as per the user stories, right? And the designers are only looking at the aspect ratio, the distance from a different sides, or like how big a certain thing is, how the animation is smooth or something like this. But all of this thing, when you have to write a test, is very tricky to do this, because as a developer, you're writing it in sort of a programming language and with a certain framework and getting it to work as it is, and then validate this for your own confidence that what you are building as a feature is actually working or not. So what if anyone could write these UI tests? The point that I'm trying to make here is that it shouldn't be the idea that only developers are writing those UI tests, but the test should be so easy to write that anyone could write them. Maybe the designers could write this, or the QA people can write this. Technically, QA people would ideally be writing some UI tests anyways. But let's say the product owner who writes the user stories can also be able to write this. So we'll actually get into this, like how easy some stuff is to do in terms of writing those UI tests. So this is when Maestro comes into the picture. So basically, Maestro is a new tool out there. It's more like a mobile UI automation framework for mobile platforms. And what it does is that it basically allows you to write very simple, basic UI tests that doesn't require you to set up a lot of things, but basically just work right out of the box. The same test works across Android, iOS, and then you have other cross-platform frameworks like Flutter and React Native, which also actually at the end of the day translate into Android and iOS. So You're mostly talking about Android and iOS specifically. Um, so this is where Maestro actually trumps up. It uses a YAML file format and kind of like a natural language to write test, which is the point that it has as an extra point where it allows anyone to write it. It's like you speaking something and then you writing the same thing as your UI test. So we'll actually get into this. But first, let's understand that how is Maestro actually able to support all these UI tests that we'll be writing. And with that one UI test, what all can it do in terms of when targeting a certain mobile platform? So on Android, the legacy, as we call them now, the views, the XML views, those can be targeted on as iPhones or iOS in general. You can do UI kit. Jetpack Compose is also supported. Swift UI is also supported. React Native in general is also supported, and Flutter also is supported. So Maestro basically is taking care of almost all the major platforms here and the technology that they are using right now for drawing of their UI. So how does the Maestro flow look like? Okay, so this is an example Maestro flow, or we call them as flows in this case, but they are technically your UI test. But for the rest of the talk, we'll call them as flows because that's what the nomenclature that Maestro is using in general. So this one is for Android. And notice how the test is written or the flow is written. You have an app ID, which is how you target a certain application in which the UI test would run. Then it's very straightforward. These steps are written as launch the app, tap on something, tap on another thing, then input some text, then tap on something else, input some more text, and then tap on save. That's it. That's your test. It's done as it is. No extra framework setup, nothing like this. In general, what you have done in part of like setting up Maestro is just install Maestro using their, they have a URL or installation instructions, and you get a Maestro CLI. And at the end, what you need to do is that you need to just run this file using the command maestro test flow.yaml file. That's it. Now, I said that the same test could actually be used across iOS and let's say React Native and Flutter. How do I do that? So for that, the same test for iOS would look exactly the same this version as you can see here. What has changed is actually the app ID. So I'm going to go back and forth between the slides so you can see the difference here. So you have the app ID, which is changing from Android contacts to Apple contacts. And the test is exactly the same. The way you run it is also the same. So what exactly is changing is that you are changing how you target the application on a certain platform. Apple has, in the iOS version, has an app ID, which corresponds to a different naming, let's say. And then on Android, you have a different package name. So you refer to it from that version. This can actually be fed from the outside. So for example, right now you're saying maestro test flow.yaml, actually passing the app ID as part of your command. And that would just mean that when you're running it for iOS, you just pass in a different ID. And when you're running it for Android, you pass in a different ID. So this is how it's basically the same test running across both platforms. And most of this magic is done by Maestro in general. So we'll talk more about what Maestro can actually do. So the first thing that we need to get into right now is writing flows in general. So how do we write this? We can be talking about a lot of things regarding how Android code is written, how iOS code is written, but none of that is important to Maestro in general. Maestro only targets the UI test as something that's like completely black box. Once the app is done and it's installed into the device, that's when it basically just goes and does those UI tests. It doesn't care how it was written, which is why when you have Flutter and React Native, they compile into an APK or the iOS equivalent, and then they install the app into the device or an emulator or a simulator, and that's when Maestro runs on it. It doesn't care about the development process of how it was, the app was written, but rather once the app is compiled, that's where Maestro will actually run. So this allows it to be more, let's say, comprehensive in terms of like targeting these platforms. This is why it's able to target so many different variants. It's able to target the Jetpack Compose version and the XML version, Swift UI and UI kit version. And this is basically just the extra advantage that you get for with Maestro. So before we get into like writing these flows, I want to emphasize on how the examples will. So I wanted to show you that how Maestro actually works across different platforms and how versatile it is. So instead of picking one of the platforms, in this case, I would have picked up Android or iOS. What I did was I tried to make it a more of a mix. So Flutter basically would allow us to write code in just one language, in this case Dart, and be able to compile for web, iOS, and Android at the same time. But because I'm going to be showing you examples for Android specifically, so I'm mixing in with an Android device where all the applications would be installed. And then on top of that, Maestro test would run on the Android device in general. So all examples are basically going to follow through. But the one thing to note here is that because Maestro doesn't care about the platform in general, you can run the exact same test on an iOS device too. There is no limitation. It's more or less, I'm trying to show you the variations that it can achieve in this case. And it's not very specifically a native platform testing framework, but it's more of an mobile testing UI automation platform. So let's get into creating something like very basic that everyone usually would do, right? So for example, the one thing that we are doing quite often when you're making some application is creating a login screen. So what you want to achieve is the screen that you see on your right. It's a screenshot of an app that's already written in Flutter, but the code doesn't matter as much. It has two input fields and it is a login button. What it does is that when you enter your email and your password, and then you hit login, takes you to another page where it says it's the home screen. So notice the test that we are writing for this, right? Again, it's very straightforward. It's going exactly how you would be doing things as if you were explaining it to someone. So the first thing it wants to do is that it has an app ID. It needs to target the application. It wants to run the UI test on. Then it says launch the app. Wait until the enter your email is visible. So it wants to make sure that the first paint has happened. And then it goes on and taps onto the enter your email field. Inputs text. In this case, it will enter android.worldwide@example.com. Again, goes to the next input field, enter your password, and then inputs the text there. In this case, the password it will enter is android.worldwide.password. And then when it's done with all of this stuff, it's going to actually hit a login button. And then eventually, the idea is that it will end up onto a different screen. It will navigate to the next screen. And that's where it will assert if the home screen text is visible in the UI. So this is the whole test. There is no tricks around this. What will happen from the next slide is that I will basically run Maestro test and the name of this test file, which will be login.yaml. And this is how it will look to you when you were to run this test. Even before I get there, actually, I want to mention one more thing, is that as I was reading this, notice that how this translates very similar to how product managers are writing user stories. So something that I did was that when I wrote this test, I also added extra comments in here to highlight how a user story would be written. So this one, if I highlight just the comments in this case, is it will read how a product manager will write its user stories. And notice how easy it is for them also to be able to write the test. As a user, I want to launch the app. You just basically call launch the app. You say wait until the first UI is presented, has a field, enter your email, extend wait until, certain keywords that Maestro uses, and then you just basically write your test all the way till the end. So meaning, going back to the same concept that I started with, that anyone can actually write this test. It's so easy to write. You don't have to worry about how to target an ID, how to do, I don't know, some tricks around getting the certain value out of this. We'll also see some scrolling things, which is quite being tricky with Espresso on Android, but those are examples that we eventually see. So this is what the final test looks with all the information. And then this is how it will look when you will run it. So notice how it's actually running everything on its own. It's typing everything out. And as it hits the login button, it also says that, okay, the home screen is visible and it has asserted that it has reached to the next screen. Notice I'm also taking some screenshots on the way. So the last line says take screenshot of home screen. That allows me to make sure that once I'm at a certain point in time in the mobile app journey, I am also able to take screenshots and keep them for my record, and then later on share it with the designers so that they can be sure of what the you are giving information first to the designer. Those screenshots, you can send it over to them. They are generated as part of the automation process. This is obviously confidence level for you that you are doing everything correct and everything is working. And also when it goes to the QA part, they are also able to run the same test and be able to see that everything works as it is. So that's just one way of how a Maestro test looks for logging UI. But how does it like work across all the different frameworks that already exist? So we'll get into this. Let's go into the version that is KMM and Maestro. So KMM is the Kotlin multi-platform mobile. Notice I'd mentioned that Maestro doesn't care about how the code is written, but what it cares about is what is rendered on the device. So if you had, let's say, an Android XML view which has a button widget, the thing that Maestro cares about when you have a certain step that says tap on login is the text part. So basically what it's doing is there is a certain command for this also, which I have not mentioned, but I will let you explore the documentation. That one is called Maestro hierarchy. So basically whenever something is drawn on the screen, it captures the nested hierarchy and looks for the text using a regex search. And that's what it's doing. So if your button has a text login on it, it knows what button we are talking about and it's going to go and tap on it. The same applies for Jetpack Compose version code. As you can see, you have a button and then you have a text and that has a string value in it. It is going to look through all of the nodes and then eventually find that specific node that has the string login and then tap on it, like make a click on it. One question that people ask me quite often is that what if there are more than two of these buttons? Let's say there's a button, a login button there, and then there's another one that is also of the same text or string in this case having login. So Maestro actually has an option to handle this. It basically says if you have more than one matches, then you can tell what index you are referring to. So imagine that you had three of those matches come up and you want to select the second button, then your index is basically one because indexes will start from zero. It stores them in an error. And then it picks up the second one because you can tell it that the second one is what I would want to pick up and tap on. And all of the stuff that the style that Maestro is using, all these keyword things, is eventually going to become super easy by the end of this talk. But we'll get there eventually. Let's go there slowly and then see how other things that Maestro can take care of. The same thing, if let's say you had a button in Jetpack Compose which doesn't have a string, how do you target that? So in this case, you can actually assign a semantics to your button. So in this case, floating action button that has an icon in its place. You are assigning it a tag, which acts as an ID. And then later on, you just go ahead and say tap on a certain ID and the ID, the string value that you have assigned to that button. So even if your button doesn't have string in it, it doesn't have text in it, you can assign it some sort of an ID to make it work with Maestro. Okay, because this is Kotlin multi-platform mobile, we also have to talk about iOS and how it does things. So if you were to do it with UI kit, you will literally define it as a LED button, UI button, and then you will set a title on your button. Again, Maestro will run through the UI hierarchy and it will basically look for the string in its place, log in, and then find that node and click on it as it wants to do it. Same thing goes for Swift UI. The code looks quite similar to Jetpack Compose. They have quite similarity in that sense, but the concept remains the same. You have a certain text, you have a string inside a button, and Maestro is looking at each node, and until it finds it, it looks for it and then taps on it. So again, KMM is something where you are sharing code, and Maestro is only caring about what the final UI that it paints out of it. When it gets to Flutter, the concept still remains the same. You will see that you have a widget that's called an elevated button, or you have an outline button or something like this. When you create these buttons, you also sometimes would assign a text to it. In this case, let's say I'm assigning a child to elevated button text, and then it has a string login, and Maestro would again doesn't care about how you created this, but rather in the view hierarchy, just go ahead and find that node and tap on it to allow you to move with it. How does it work with React Native? Okay, so in React Native, you have a widget that looks something like this. You have a button, and then you have a title that you can assign to it. And again, Then again, Maestro is looking at the view hierarchy and tapping on it. So I guess you get the uptick to all these different platforms doing things. It does have its logic internally, how it does it for React Native and how it does it for Flutter, or how it does for Android and iOS. But to the end users, the developers, the QA people, the product owners, or the designers, it basically abstracts all of that away. It takes you into a step where you just need to say tap on login, and that's it. How everything works behind the scene is something that is abstracted away from you, and that's the magic that Maestro actually comes with. It makes UI writing UI tests so much easier and exciting that you don't actually have to worry about how to do all these framework setup and fiddle with different language styles and everything. But I would be telling you a lie if I didn't say that Maestro doesn't have a very extensive documentation. And there are many ways that you can actually target certain elements. What I showed you is basically how you tap on something, how do you find something using a text string or something. But then there are many things that you can do. Like, for example, you can hide a keyboard, you can set a location, you can copy text from keyboard, you can clear your keychain, you can go back a step, like hitting back on your device. All of these different ways how to work with your device in terms of your handling your UI is taken care of Maestro. They basically explain everything. There's an option of swiping. We'll also see that one. And there's an option of how you scroll through something. But we'll also again see an example for this. So go through the documentation, actually see what are the different ways of targeting different nodes and UI elements, and that will allow you to write much better UI tests right away. The another one that people mostly talk about is the sign up screen, quite common. What you would ideally do is that you will have some sort of a name, you will have your password, your email, your password, re-enter your password. And then when you sign up, you end up on your login screen, and then it's the same flow again. So we're actually gonna reuse the login screen in the next one that we see. So the sign up UI is gonna look something similar as you see on the right. I've taken a screenshot in this case. So you have your name, you have your email, you enter your password, and then you re-enter your password. And then when you click on sign up, you would end up on a login screen. On the left is the whole UI test that you would write for your sign up flow, but we can see it in parts. So let's go small parts for this one. So basically you're launching the app, you're saying, I want to stop the app when I launch it, if it's already running. And when I launch it, I'm going to clear all its states. Like it shouldn't be in a certain view state or something. It's going to start from scratch. The second thing that you're asking is that you need to wait until the field is visible. So the first paint has happened and there is something on the screen before it will actually go on to tap on, in this case saying enter your name. Then it will input the text of Android worldwide and it will go and enter your email. Same step. The second part of the test is again talking about how you enter your password, you re-enter your password. Then you take a screenshot actually because you want to know what state your screen is in. And then when you tap on sign up, what will actually happen is that your screen gets navigated to the next flow, which is the login flow. But remember, because we wrote the login flow quite early on, and in this case, I'm reusing the same UI screen. So I can actually run the same file again as part of this flow. So basically, sign up flow is running a secondary file called login.yaml file, and it is allowing me to reuse an existing test and run it through. This sounds tricky, but it's actually not. It's basically saying that when you get to the next page, I want you to confirm that the page has a login button on it, and then you start running your login.yaml file. So let's see this in action in the video that I have there. So it's right now running the sign up flow. It's going through this, tap on re-enter your password, tap on sign up, and notice immediately it's switched into a second flow, which says run login.yaml when login is visible. Right now it's running the login flow, the one that we already saw earlier, and then it ends up on the home screen in general. So again, one test that you've written for, let's say, a certain part of your flow, you can reuse it in another flow if it's part of a bigger flow. Because in this case, we are going from sign up to login and then to the home screen. We just reused our login flow right away. Maybe a bit tricky, not as easy as this one. But yeah, going into scrolling, that's when things start to get tricky. But what Maestro does is it makes everything still super easy. So the test that you're going to see right now is basically saying that you have a list of items. You quite often have this. You have a news item app or something similar like this. And what you have to do is that you have to scroll through them. And then at the bottom, there is a submit button and it will try to click on it. So what we are doing in this case right now is that the test is literally saying that you launch the app, stop the app if it's already running, clear the state, and then go on and start scrolling. So what it's saying is that you will repeat the command scroll as long as submit button is not visible. So imagine there's like, I don't know, 10 pages to scroll until the submit button shows up. Then you don't have to actually count how many times it takes it. It's going to go even 11 times if the screen size is small until it sees the submit button, which is what we are saying that you will keep scrolling until submit is not visible to you. So Maestro basically is taking away all this logic away from you to think how to do this, calculate how much the screen size is, and how much you can scroll, or how many elements you can scroll. You don't even have to think about elements at this point. What you're caring about is the view element, the widget that I'm concerned about. Is it visible in the UI or not? Making things very easy for you. Also, the scroll event is basically just called scroll. There is no other tricks around it. You literally just say scroll and it scrolls it, makes a flick of a thumb, automated obviously, not by a human, but it tries to scroll up right away and then reaches the bottom. And then when it has done that, it will tap on submit. At this point, you could actually navigate to the next screen and do something else. But this test is basically trying to focus on just how the scrolling works and how do you like even get to the last point of the screen. Um, Something that I should mention right away is that I've kept most of these UI tests super simple because I want to focus on those specific things. But there's nothing stopping you from connecting one flow to the other one, the same way as I showed you for the sign up flow. You could technically have used this submit button to go to another one, maybe end up on a sign up flow, and then go into login flow, and you can keep chaining things up as much as you want. There is no limitation in terms of how you can run nested flows. So that's it. This is the smallest test that you will see. Let's see this in function, how it's going to run. So it's clean up. Now it's trying to scroll vertically. And after 2 scrolls, it's already found the submit button. So it's going to click on it and complete the test. And yeah, it's a looping GIF, so it will just go on showing you the same things. Okay, so that gets us to the point of like saying, okay, we can do scrolling in the vertical sense. By the way, there is an option to actually also scroll in different directions. This is what leads us into the next version of this one, which is scrolling horizontally. Because up till now we are scrolling like up, and then the screen is obviously going down, and then it's quite normal stuff, very default activity to do. But then there are cases, let's say for example, on Play Store you have horizontal list. And then you have in some places where you want to scroll down, as in the screen is going down and then you are getting more up. And then either you could be scrolling from the right and then you want the screen to go from the left to right. So in this case, this is an example app that I've also again created with the same Flutter code. These are different screens in the same project itself. Basically, you have a list of items and you can scroll them from the right. And basically, you are going in horizontal direction for them. But notice how the test has changed a little bit, and I'm doing some tricks here, which I will mention. So what I'm doing here is that I'm launching the app, stopping the app in case it's already been started, clearing the state. And then I'm saying scroll until visible the element more. So it will keep scrolling. This is another way of doing the same scroll thing that we did with repeat. You just have a much more better defined helper style of doing this thing, right? So what the unique thing in this version though is that you are scrolling until the more element is visible, but also I'm able to specify the direction. So in this case, I'm saying you're going from right to left. So you're scrolling right to left, and that would move your horizontal last point, which is the button called more. Tap more, and basically either go to the next flow or you will submit something and then maybe load up a better list with more items in it. So let's see this in function. This is how the app looks like. You launch the app, so scrolling right until more is visible. And then you're basically just going with this and then tapping on more to get the value, or at least assertion in the case of the test. Okay, so we talked about scrolling, we talked about standard input, talked about clicking buttons. But what we have not talked about is situations where you need to input some sort of like a delay. Like for example, something that I'm also going to show you as an example is that when you click on something, you need to fetch some information from a remote database or something. In that time, there's a progress bar that's going to be running. And when everything is done, you're going to be saying that, okay, success, we have the information. I'm going to update the UI. Now, in those cases, even though Maestro has an inbuilt let's say non-flakiness situation, like it has tolerance to keep looking for things until it has happened. If a view is not visible, it's going to wait a few seconds, milliseconds. You can define the timeout for those. But then there are some times when you already know that the animation is going to specifically run for, I don't know, 5 seconds or something. So you don't want a Maestro test to fail before those 5 seconds. So what Maestro is doing is it's allowing you to specify that delay in there, it's allowing you to tell it when an animation is about to get over, and that's when it will actually move on to the next step. If you don't tell it the time it takes for the animation to finish, it might time out and it would fail the test. So there's a provision for introducing those delays. Although Maestro says this on the documentation page, it actually doesn't favor adding these delays because it already is taking into account some sort of like a delay internally into the system. But sometimes you need it. It's the flexibility that is more important. So one of the ways that you would do this, and I've already shown this, is extended wait until. So basically, you're saying that I'm going to wait until certain element is visible on the screen. And then I also set a timeout. So in this case, it's 10,000 milliseconds. And it's going to wait for those number of milliseconds. And then if it cannot find it, it will either fail it, or it will basically say that, okay, if I find it, it will right away go to the next step. So it's not going to exactly wait for 10 seconds if it finds it in, like, say, 2000 milliseconds. If it finds it, it will just move on to the next step and just continue with the whole thing. So let's see an example of this, how we'll do this. You see the final version, but basically there's a progress bar in this case, and it will load, and then ready will show. The progress bar itself takes 3 seconds to run. There's a timer in there. But the test looks like this. You launch an app, set up and wait until you know that the timeout is going to be around 4,000 milliseconds. It's technically 4,000. And then you wait for the new item to show up as an alert if ready is visible. And then take a screenshot of this, the animation screen, which is what you are actually seeing on the side. The screenshot is exactly the same thing. Let's see if it's working. So we launched the app beginning. And then it goes through that timeout. And then eventually when the ready text shows up, it says alert that ready is visible. So you can see that when extended wait is running. And then once it is completed, that I am back, I think.
Yes, you are absolutely right. You're back. You don't have to think about that.
let me share my screen again.
Yes, please.
Okay, so we are sharing. Tell me when we're ready.
We are there. I'll go into the
Okay, great.
background.
Okay, great. Okay, we had some technical issues and I got logged out for something, but I'm back. So yeah, basically I was going through the step mentioning that, okay, it's going to go through the extended wait and then continue on to alert if the new text is visible after the progress has gone through, and then take a screenshot. We're going to actually go into the next version of this, wherein we say that we actually just know that we don't even want to have an extended wait kind of a thing, but rather we know how when the animation is going to end. And in this case, the timeout we are setting is 5,000 milliseconds. So we're going to see the same test, the one that I wrote with extended wait, use wait for animation to end, another way of doing the same thing, wherein the test is exactly the same. There will be a progress bar when it finishes in 3 seconds or something, then ready text is shown. And in this case, I set the timeout to 3000 milliseconds, which is exactly what the progress bar is also set to timeout in. And let's see the test here running. We'll launch the app, wait for the animation to end. This is what it says also in the test, and assert that ready is visible and take the screenshot from there onwards, which was visible in the last slide. So as you can see, it's quite easy to jump between these or like animation, delays, adding all of this thing. There's a lot of flexibility in terms of writing those UI tests. Most of these things that I'm showing is quite easy, but they are the core of how you write your UI components. And if there is a trick that you are doing with your, I don't know, with your UI, you're doing some sort of like a swiping gesture or something, there is provision in the API to do those kind of swipe gestures, like with a certain speed. You want to do it on the right side, you want to do it very slowly, you want to drag it. All of this exists as part of the API. But with all the tests that you're writing, everything that you have, QA people still require you to have reports. And in the beginning, Maestro actually didn't have reports, but then they actually added this feature. And getting a report is mostly talking about when you have multiple tests in a directory, then you just get a report of how many of them pass and how many of them fail. So in this case, when you have multiple of these flows, those flow files inside a directory, and you execute Maestro test, and then you pass in a format for this, in this case, JUnit, and .maestro is the directory name. It's basically a hidden directory in Mac and Linux, but maybe Windows, you can have a different version. And when you run this command, basically what it does is it prints out which of the tests passed and which of the tests failed. So it looks something like this. When you run Maestro test format JUnit Maestro, it will say fail sign up, pass login, pass vertical scroll, pass horizontal scroll. And this basically is what you get. The output of this command though is a JUnit file. It's a .xml file, and that's not very readable. So what I found out is that in order to see it more readable, I actually convert it using this tool called JUnit to HTML. And it's a very straightforward tool. It literally says JUnit to HTML, pass in a JUnit file. So the XML file that you got from the task command, and then the new HTML file that you want. And when you get that, you can literally just double click it and open it in your browser, and it just works out of the box. You can see the result. It says these number of times it's failed, these number of times it's passed. And in case of when it has failed, it actually shows you the stack trace of why it failed. So the report becomes more useful for you when you're running it on your as an HTML file. So yeah, so now that you have all of this, I think you need to get to the part of like running this in the CI, and that's where Maestro Cloud comes out. So Maestro Cloud in general is something that's an offering from mobile.dev itself, the people who behind Maestro CLI. We have been using Maestro CLI completely locally. You have not been running this on the CI. But what mobile.dev people have done is that they have actually created a cloud component of this. And what they do is that they provide you this infrastructure that's dedicated and optimized to run Maestro test. They have managed iOS simulators and Android emulator support. So you can literally run all your Flutter, React, iOS, Android variations that you would for your test on a certain device. All of this is available to you. But you're not logged into Maestro Cloud. So the thing that you need to understand is that there is ways that you can integrate this with your own CI. The reason this is possible is because Maestro Cloud itself uses Maestro CLI, the one that you run locally. It also runs it in its cloud. It's just an offering there that they utilize, and they obviously charge money for it. But Maestro Cloud in general is not the only way to run Maestro test. You could run Maestro CLI the way you do it on your local machine. Just go ahead and run it as part of your GitHub Actions or Bitrise or GitLab, any of these CI providers, and it will totally run as it is without any problems while generating those reports that you would want to. But a thing to know though is that the GitHub Actions, Bitrise, and all of these, they also have some native integration with Maestro Cloud. So basically, once you are in GitHub Actions, you could trigger a Maestro test run inside Maestro Cloud. They have native integrations. So if you do want to invest into Maestro Cloud, which is a very good offering, you get more information, I think, debug information, more reports, and more detailed values out of this Maestro Cloud thing, you could totally go that route, and it's totally possible to run this. And last but not the least, the most important thing, I've been talking about so much things that you can do locally. You can write it in a YAML file, you can do everything. But then quite recently, Maestro has actually invested into making writing these tests very easy. So I'm going to show you an example that's going to speak more than what I can talk about it. But basically, Maestro Studio is like a GUI version of writing Maestro tests. You don't have to open your VS Code or something, or a text or notepad or something to write this by hand, but rather you can, Maestro Studio is a GUI version where you can select the element and it will tell you what variations of Maestro command you could run or how you would run it. So here's the video. You can see it. The way that you trigger this is you call Maestro Studio on your CLI and it opens it in a browser. Notice how I'm selecting something and then Maestro Studio is suggesting me some options. So when I select enter your email, it's actually showing me tap your email, and then I'm selecting that, pressing enter, and then I can run this command itself. So that's what it's doing. Technically, I can enter my own command also here. I can say, I don't know, input text and then enter some sort of like an email address here, and that would also work in the same way. And this is still going into, let's say, more development, but it's still very good. At this point, you can actually export your file. You can select all the commands that you have come up with, and they give you an option of exporting it as a file, as a YAML file. So you don't write it by hand, but rather you click on elements as your app is running, and you don't even have to remember the commands at this point, because Maestro Studio is giving you all the options right away as a suggestion, and you select what you want to do with the element right away. So that is, I guess, all of it in terms of what Maestro is able to do right now. There's a lot of things that Maestro is thinking about of improving and also bringing to the mobile platforms. So the best way to go with this is to just keep following their GitHub repository. They are doing a lot of good work in the Slack channel. They always ask for feedback from people. So you should go ahead and also join the Slack if you could. But make sure to follow their GitHub account. And yeah, that's all there is for Maestro from my side. Open to questions if there are any.
Yes, there is. Everyone is enticed by your presentation, so definitely there will be questions. Okay, so Ryan just wanted to understand. He wanted to understand how does the code looks like when it's auto-generated by Maestro. Do you have any insights around that?
Yeah. Okay. So basically, Maestro is not generating any code for your mobile app, right? So you're writing your own mobile app code. You're writing the Jetpack Compose version. You're writing your Flutter version. You're writing your React Native version. You're writing your Swift UI, UI kit, all variations that you usually do as part of your development practice as a developer, as a native mobile app developer or a cross-platform mobile app developer. What Maestro is actually taking care of is once the app is created, it's compiled, and it's running on the device, that's when Maestro runs on the UI of that app. It's running on compiled code rather than on the code. There is no mobile code involved in this case. This is the best part about Maestro setup in general. This is more about maybe empowering more people to write UI tests, because everyone is just so afraid to write UI tests. We have been exposed to Espresso and all these like tricky frameworks. This is letting you get your foot in the door and be able to start writing UI tests and have more confidence and know when something breaks down. But yeah, your mobile development code is completely different from what Maestro is taking care of. Maestro is only looking at your view hierarchy once it's rendered rather than before it is rendered.
Okay. Thank you for that. On the similar lines, which you also answered in your previous question, but I'll put it again. Zeus is asking, for beginners, which framework for testing should I start with? Should I learn Espresso first, or rather than go with yours?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, a lot of people have this question. The thing is that learning Espresso is always going to be beneficial to you because that's native to Android. And the same way as learning, I guess, Appium, which is actually cross-platform, so you can also do iOS stuff, is always going to be better to you because they are like tried and tested platforms. However, as a beginner, if you want to just start writing some UI tests for your hobby project, for your, even at work, it's actually very good to introduce at work and just get something out the door while you're learning Espresso or Appium in the background. that's a better approach. Go with the Maestro test first. It's easy to write, and then go on to start doing Espresso tests with the time that you have. However, I can tell you this: in my past company that I was working at, I basically advocated that we stop doing Espresso tests in there, but rather do more Maestro tests. So by the time I was leaving the company, we had like around 50, 60 tests in place, and that just allows the developers to actually iterate faster with the feature. So at the end, Maestro is more about confidence to the developers, to the QA, to the designers, and the product owners, because everything just reads so well. But yeah, preference is always that you want to do something that gives you confidence. The test is there for you to get the confidence. So Maestro should be your initial step, and then Espresso for sure. You cannot skip Espresso, is what I want to say. That's the more important part.
Yeah, thank you for answering that. And I definitely agree. Sticking, like, yes, you should definitely go with the framework, but sticking to the native framework is also really helpful because things change very quickly. So you should be able to at least know what is the underlying foundation and how it is working around. Okay.
True.
Thank you for that. Let's wait for a few more minutes for more questions to come in.
Mm-hmm.
Since we are talking about testing, like a very stupid question, and normally people ask this in interviews, what level of test coverage you should have? Like, what percentage of test coverage you should have?
Yeah, it's the tricky question, right? This is how they decide if you're gonna make it in the interview. Yeah, I think at the end of the day, what matters is the test coverage thing became quite famous at some point in time when people started using it as a metric to measure, I don't know how much coverage they have, and that's like a higher number to show to people, right? To leadership team or something. But in general, sometimes having a certain test coverage doesn't make sense. If it's simply entering text in a text field, you know it is working. Writing a test around it is not going to help you with this. What does make sense is all your critical features are covered by test. So your test coverage could be 10% in the whole code base, but it's actually covering all the critical features that it needs to. You're actually pretty good in that sense. But if you're aiming for 90% and your features are breaking apart, that's not helping you. That's the one that goes wrong mostly.
Yeah, I agree. Like most of the times, normally people say, "Yeah, you have so less test coverage," but then they don't ask you whether those tests are meaningful tests or not. Like there are
Exactly.
there are n number of ways just to make sure the code coverage is 100%, but they might not be doing anything under the hood. So definitely. Okay. I don't see any more questions coming in. So thank you once again, Nishant, for sharing this thing. Oh, no. Let me hold on. We got one other one.
Yeah, I saw it. Um, what all types of assertions are supported in Maestro? Okay, so right now Maestro is supporting mainly three kinds of assertions. Okay, so one is that it will assert true or false. It will assert something is there or not. So assert visible or not visible. But then because this framework initially started as a very it's very new to the ecosystem right now, right? So it's trying to do things and it's eventually evolving. So what they figured out is that it actually cannot assert a lot of these properties internally. So they came up with a different JavaScript. So there's something called assertion while running JavaScript, and that just opens up a different world for you because now you have programmatic access to your view hierarchy, and you can actually write logic inside that JavaScript block, and then you can do your check. However, as I said, because it's quite new on the block, it's been probably like, I guess, 1.5 or 2 years or something, or maybe 3 years. And what you would see eventually is that there will be more assertions provided, the same way as some new APIs are coming up as a replacement for the same thing. So in beginning, there was wait for animation to end, but then eventually they agreed that we want to do extend with wait, which is a similar API, but it allows more things to do. Same way I showed you repeat the scroll command, but then they came up with something called scroll with visible, and then it also has a direction. So the API is evolving, and I assume like over a period of time, they will actually come up with more assertions. As of now, I've used this quite extensively, and I can tell you that I haven't not needed much bigger assertion as Appium or I don't know Espresso uses, because most of the stuff I'm only checking it as a black box. It's more of an integration test, so I'm not caring about asserting, I guess, the color of a view. But you can totally do it through the JavaScript interface that they provide now.
Okay, thank you for this one. Let's wait for another minute. Okay,
Yeah.
because we last time I was about to close the session and then Zeus asked something. So let's wait for another minute.
Yeah. I guess people are pondering like what else is possible with Maestro.
Yeah.
I can say this that I've used it for quite a lot of different kind of UIs in production. The ones I showed you in the product in the slides, sorry, in the slides in general, they are very easy just so that you can understand it as someone who's consuming this content. But as you start doing it on a production app, you will see it's actually very easy to write. And we had nested flows going in like 3 or 4 levels, and all the tests were running against it, and we could run it like in like 5 or 10 minutes. Everything was done, 60, 70 tests, and like 100% coverage in terms of like what we did. And then we'll be like, yeah, this makes sure like we are not breaking any UI at least. This was a very good confidence boost for the team when I was working with the company.
Okay. Uh, oh, if you have an open source project, probably you can add some test around it and share link with us, because since you already have an expertise around that framework, it would really help people to get a jump start around it. So if you already have, you can share it. If you don't have it,
Yeah.
I would love to have that.
Yeah. Well, maybe I should mention this. So the slides for this talk, I will publish it and I will send the link, and maybe can be shared by the organizers, as well as the project that I use. The small examples, they are very easy to play with. They already have those tests, so I will actually publish them on GitHub. They're not yet there on GitHub, but maybe I'll do some cleaning and then push it up. And then you can play with it. Just do the things that I just did, run it, and then see what all tricks you want to do with these small projects. It's very easy to work with a small project, but if you want a bigger one, maybe I'll publish that also, and then you can also start seeing those.
Yeah, getting started at least would be really helpful. Thank you for sharing all this. I don't see anything coming up now. Okay, so thank you, Nishant, for coming to Android Worldwide and sharing your knowledge with us. We really appreciate you coming here.
Thank you for having me. It was very nice.